welcome to F4 Talks. With me is John Pfeffer, a long-time Fair Observer author and a great scholar. He's a playwright, he's an actor, he's a spokesman, and he is a linguist as well. So welcome to you, John.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Brilliant. Today we are discussing Syria. And for those of you who don't know much about Syria, this is the perfect place to begin. So let's start off, John, with a very simple question. What has happened? Why are we even talking about Syria today?
Not such a simple question, but I'll try to answer it. I mean, we're talking about Syria today because, of course, there was a dramatic change in the political complexion of Syria. Syria had been living several decades under the father and son dictatorship of the Assads. Most
Yes,
recently, Bashar al-Assad, the son, who originally had trained to be a dentist and then went into his father's business, which was basically tyranny. And when he took over,
that's because his brother, who was the more savage and brutal and risk-seeking and thrill-loving, died.
that's right. That's right. It's a very good likelihood that Bashar would have stayed as a dentist
Correct.
if he had had his druthers, but he didn't. So he's kind of press ganged into the office. And at the
I
time,
mean,
many people thought
it's supposedly a Baathist republic, and yet the Middle East being the Middle East, everything becomes a monarchy.
basically yes. And Baathism, of course, was some version of socialism, a kind of mid-Eastern version, if you will, practiced theoretically in Iraq as well. But what it
Correct.
came down
Saddam
to
Hussein
was
was the other person. Saddam Hussein
exactly.
and Hafiz al-Assad were two Baathist leaders in the Middle East. For those of you who don't know, um, both of them were minorities in their own country. Saddam was Sunni in a largely Shia and Kurdish country, and Hafiz was Alevi in a largely Sunni country. So the irony of ironies. And they were actually friends and allies, believe it or not.
Yes, and very similar governing style, to be honest. Forget about socialism of any type, although, of course, the government did dominate the economies in both cases.
Mhm.
But the expectation was, the Bashar would maybe even reform the place a little bit because he had been educated in the West, which is often a fallacy. Somehow exposure to ideas in England or elsewhere will turn someone into a progressive
Well,
or a
it did work
reformer.
with Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, he did develop a love for rule of law and all that
It's
stupid Western stuff.
Yes, in South Africa, and but also a thirst for justice when he was in South Africa.
Yes.
Something
Yeah.
I think Bashar al-Assad did not develop. Um, but in 2011, after some time already as a kind of repressive leader, we had the spread of the Arab Spring. Of course, it began outside of Syria, but it spread pretty quickly by March to Syria, and a serious direct threat against Assad's rule by, at first, nonviolent protests, kind of a democracy movement of sorts, but in part because of the repression of the regime, turned to violent means to try to overthrow Assad. And then because of a vacuum of power both in Iraq and then in Syria, in the ensuing civil war, the growth of the Islamic State, which seized swaths of territory in both Iraq and Syria, which brought in other countries, Russia, the United States, certainly Turkey, to try to defeat this global jihadist movement, which was more or less successful in the sense that it reduced the holdings, shall we say, of the Islamic State quite dramatically. And it looked as if, Bashar had survived all of this, the challenges of the Arab Spring, the challenge of the Islamic State. He could count on significant support from Russia. Obviously, the Soviet Union had been a big supporter of Syria during the Cold War. He could count on support from over the border in Iran, a largely Shia country, and was able to kind
And he
of
had
then,
sympathizers in Iraq as well. And of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon was very closely allied with Bashar al-Assad and
Yes.
helped him survive the rebellion which the Islamic State offered, or which the
Yes.
Islamic State unfurled.
Yes, and indeed, it was Hezbollah, which basically served as kind of the shock troops, if you will,
Yeah.
of Iran. I mean, Iran provided some armaments, of course, some technical guidance, the Revolutionary Guard providing some inspiration, if you will. But the fighters on the ground, Hezbollah and folks from Iraq, Shia fighters from Iraq, moving in and saving Bashar al-Assad's skin, basically. But, by 2000, by 2020 rather, you had a kind of a ceasefire take place, brokered by outside actors, Turkey, Russia, some Middle Eastern actors. And you had the
Qatar
kind
in
of,
particular, I suppose.
yes, and you had the opposition forces kind of ghettoized, if you will, in different parts of the country. And it looked as if they were not big enough to really overthrow a tyrannical regime the size of Bashar al-Assad, and an army, that was considerable as well. You had, for instance, Kurdish forces up in the northeast, uh, basically in control of a couple of cantons there. You had Turkish forces or Turkish allied forces just over the border, and a remnant of when Turkey had actually intervened in Syria during that period before. You had something called HTS. HTS was a kind of Sunni formation.
Could
Um,
you
uh,
spell out the full?
Sure, it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And they originally were kind of aligned with Al-Qaeda, but over the years, for a variety of reasons, which we can go into, they decided to distance themselves considerably from Al-Qaeda. So HTS, above them, the Turkish, Syrian, what they call the Syrian National Army, which is confusing because it sounds like it's Assad's forces, but no. And then the Kurds. And then down in the south, you had scattered forces as well, and a U.S. military base down in the south as well that was providing some support for those opposition forces, but also kind of ensuring the flow of oil outside of Syria. Um, and that's where it was until about 3 weeks ago or so, when suddenly HTS kind of broke out of where it had been, which was Idlib province, which is up in the northwest, and it headed directly towards Aleppo, this kind of very important city. It was a kind of locus of opposition, certainly during the Arab Spring. When the government re-seized it, that was a signal somehow that Assad was successfully repelling the opposition. So seizing Aleppo was an incredible kind of jolt in the arm and a surprise. But even more surprising was the fact that the Syrian government army basically just disappeared. It hardly put up a fight at all. And that was the writing on the wall. As soon as that happened, then Iran was like, this does not look good. We're not going to actually intervene. We're not going to we sent some troops, Iran sent some troops, but we're not going to actually send anybody else. We're in fact going to start withdrawing our forces and our diplomatic staff. Now, part of that was a pragmatic kind of assessment. Hezbollah had been seriously compromised in its war with Israel. Israel took out a considerable chunk of its leadership. Its rank and file were basically trying to hold on to what they could in Lebanon. So Hezbollah, a shadow of itself. Russia, of course, distracted by the war in Ukraine, had kind of realigned some of its military assets. Of course, it still maintained a key naval base, a key military field in Syria, but again, a shadow of its former self in terms of its military involvement. And Assad was like, this isn't good. My friend, Iran out of the picture, Russia out of the picture, and my government forces giving up without a fight. And I think HTS continued, obviously took over the big cities of Homs and Hama, and then finally took over Damascus, again, almost without a fight, and Assad and family kind of decamping to Russia.
To Russia. Well, I hear from intelligence sources that Assad didn't pay heed to either Russian or Iranian warnings. His officers were severely underpaid. In fact, many of them were bought over by HTS. And there seems to be backing for HTS from Turkey and possibly even from Qatar.
Yeah.
So there are wheels within wheels. And of course, we will never know until many years have elapsed as to what exactly happened. But clearly, Assad was in a state of extreme weakness. Hezbollah had been knocked out, but the social base of his regime had been winnowing thin progressively with every passing year, if not month or week.
Absolutely. I mean, the economy was in lousy shape. And I mean,
Yeah,
partly that wasn't his fault. I mean, it was
sure.
sanctions imposed from outside, but he certainly didn't help matters much. The economy, basically, in terms of what the government was producing, drug trafficking. I mean, this captagon, this form of narcotic, basically Syria had cornered the trade, and that's what the economy was running on, essentially. Um, and so, yeah, I'm sure Assad received plenty of warnings from his Iranian and Russian friends, but frankly, what could he do about it at that point? There was precious little he could offer his armed forces in terms of pay or even a larger kind of perhaps more progressive engagement in rebuilding Syrian society. Syria was already deeply fractured, population deeply unhappy with Assad. I don't think, frankly, he had any choices. The opposition, HTS, had been planning for a year, essentially, planning a year to launch this attack on Aleppo, and it knew it was outmanned by the Syrian government forces, so it had to rely on kind of asymmetrical force, and that was drones. It kind of developed its own drone fleet in order to go after government forces. It got a kind of an assist from a couple of outside actors, even uh, just a few weeks before the attack on Aleppo from Ukrainians. So there was definitely some outside assistance, and Turkey, of course, um, probably gave them the green light to kind of go ahead. But the other kind of big issue that was behind the decision to move when they did
Mhm.
was the fact that there were a number of governments who were kind of ready to bury the hatchet with Assad, to basically welcome him back into the community of tyrants, if you will, a community of nations in the Middle East. But even more
Gulf
important,
Gulf Cooperation Council had him back
exactly.
at one of
But
their
even
meetings,
even more
GCC.
important, they were considering a proposal to eliminate or at least severely reduce the sanctions, economic sanctions against Syria, if he
Aha.
cut his ties with Iran, if he did that. And I think HTS and Turkey in particular are like, we got to prevent this. We've got to prevent this kind of rapprochement. And in this way, it's actually quite interesting, the parallel with
Mm,
Hamas's decision on October
mm.
7th to attack Israel, because there too, there was a diplomatic rapprochement in the background that kind of served as the trigger. In that case, of course, it was the prospect of Saudi Arabia having
And
diplomatic
Israel.
engagement with
And
Israel.
they wanted to cut
Exactly. So
that
this is a really
possibility.
kind of an interesting new trend, if you will, that, previously decisions about whether to launch a kind of military attack were dependent on a set of other variables, configuration of
Mhm.
forces, the weather, I mean, all sorts of other things. But now it's
Weather
just,
is very important.
yes.
I speak as a former officer. You can't do anything in inclement weather. Or maybe
Yes.
you should be doing something in inclement weather.
When it's least expected. But now
Exactly.
it's the diplomatic kind of entanglements or the prospect of diplomatic reconciliation that is a prime motivator. And so I think that also explained the timing. And of course, it was around the same time that Israel and Hezbollah had signed their ceasefires, and the prospect of Hezbollah being able to turn its attention back to Syria, that also I think was a major factor.
And it seems Israel bombed a lot of crossings from Lebanon to Syria. So it suggests that there must have been some collaboration between Turkish and Israeli intelligence.
Yeah, although, Turkey and Israel are not getting along very well these days. So it,
Yes, but they
it,
can
it
always agree. The enemy of my enemy is a friend.
yes, That is true. And the other thing is they both have territorial ambitions.
Yes,
And
indeed.
obviously
We'll get to
Israel.
that. So that brings us to,
Yeah.
we've already covered why this happened, why Assad fell. Let's get on to the other question I have on my mind is who are the key actors? So
Mm.
first tell us the domestic actors, and then I'll follow up with another question about who are the key external powers meddling in the
Mhm.
melee.
So the prime at this moment is, of course, HTS. And as I said, HTS was previously affiliated with Al Qaeda, but it made perhaps a tactical or perhaps a more thoroughgoing decision, a
I mean, the
philosophical
chap, the
decision.
leader, was on CNN, and everyone is very impressed by him.
Hey, I mean, look, as far as I'm concerned, you have to go by what someone says right now and then hold him to it, hold him or her to it.
Yeah. So,
If
so
if
paint
it's
us a
yeah,
picture of this chap, this fine young man who once began life in Al Qaeda.
uh-huh. Golani. So Al Golani, he's a fighter. He's obviously a guerrilla. He has spent an enormous amount of time not only kind of diagnosing what the problems are in Syria and how to best attack the Syrian government, but perhaps more importantly, he's tried to figure out, well, how can I create a coalition of these opposition forces when we are across, all over the map in terms of religious affiliations, ideology, perspective. And so for the last year, I think that's been the real challenge. Yeah, to figure out, how to get drones, how to, press a tactical advantage, but really it's how to coordinate among all the different actors, especially forces in the south, especially the Turkish-backed forces, Kurdish, not so much, but that's the real kind of uh, uh, genius, if you will, of Al Golani in a country
May I
that could
quickly
fall
add some
apart very
color
quickly. Yeah,
for may I quickly add some color
please.
for our viewers?
Yeah.
Well, he's calls himself Abu Muhammad al Julani, and his family came from the Golan Heights. They were displaced in 1967 after Israeli occupation during the Six-Day War. And he still uses Golan or Jaulan in Arabic. And his father was an Arab nationalist student activist for the Nasirists in
Mm,
Syria. So his father was a socialist, and
mm,
the son is an Islamist, which parallels the change
yeah,
in political philosophy in the region.
yeah.
And
And
obviously,
yeah.
this is a chap with a violent past. There was a 10 million bounty on him, if I remember correctly. He was on a target list.
Mhm,
And of course, now the US has to figure out how to work with him.
mhm,
He is clearly charismatic, highly articulate.
yeah.
He's savvy, he's shrewd. He seems to have political judgment. He's visited the hospital and promised nurses higher pay, in fact, 5 times the pay they've been getting. So he's adept at building a coalition, and he's proved savvy enough to coordinate and overthrow the regime. So
Mm,
this is not just any Tom, Dick, and Harry. Has
yeah.
he given? Has he has appeared in the famous Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, hasn't he? Already?
Yeah, I believe he has, and he's
Yeah.
also, on the way to Damascus. They made a deliberate effort to kind of provide reassurances to the Christian community, not a huge community these days
Yeah.
in Aleppo, but still, and to, to send out signals that this is going to be a government, quote unquote, for all Syrians, although there obviously are some signs that that might not last for very long. But they had been
He has
administering
a big
Idlib.
beard. That is not so reassuring.
Well, I mean, I'm not so bad about
Yeah,
it.
yours is
Not so
trim, John.
bad.
You don't look like a fiery evangelical preacher.
Ah, you haven't heard me when I'm getting going. But they do have administration kind of experience. They had to
Yeah.
administer Idlib,
Yes, of
for a
course.
period of time, and
And how
that
did they do? How did they do it in Idlib?
Not too bad. I mean,
I see.
it was of course an Islamist,
Yeah.
administration. So
So did they chop off
conservative.
hands for
Yeah,
stealing, like our good friends,
no,
the Saudis?
no, no, no.
Okay.
So
Did
they're
they
not
enforce?
Wahhabists.
Okay. Did they enforce the headscarf or the chador as the
Yeah, that's a
Islamic?
good question. I mean,
Yeah.
because they, as they were moving towards
Yeah.
Damascus, we had a number of reports of interactions with women, and there was a couple of interactions in which the soldier said basically, you should have a head covering, but they didn't
Mm.
like wait around for the person to put it on. They just said, well, next time. Uh,
Next time.
which
Oh,
yes,
how very kind of them. Very tolerant.
which suggests, that well, of course, that they expect to be around for a while to
Yeah.
enforce whatever social restrictions there are. But
Yeah.
I mean, a lot remains to be seen. And I've written that there are basically three scenarios that could happen as a result of
Excellent.
what's taken place there. The first, of course, is the worst case, Sunni extremism scenario a la Afghanistan, in which you have a force which presents itself as kind of more moderate than it had been previously, but then once in power, kind of Talibanizes Syria. That's one. The second is Libya, in which you have the fall of a dictator, a vacuum of power, and all of the contending forces in society suddenly at each other's throats in order to control what remains in terms of the resources.
A
Obviously,
sort of
Syria.
fight club.
Exactly. And Syria is could be a very wealthy country.
Yeah.
And so there are plenty of resources to fight over. And then the
Mhm.
third would be the Egypt scenario, in which you have a strong man who is secular in well, probably not secular, but coming out of the military or some other kind of strong base in society that says, look, I am the only thing that can prevent the Islamists from taking over the Muslim Brotherhood, as was the case in Egypt for al-Sisi. So that's three scenarios, which are not particularly good scenarios, but
No, but let's talk about the third. That was the Assad model too, the father in particular,
yeah,
that I am the only one holding this extremely diverse and centrifugal country together.
yeah, yeah. And as you were in kind of implying, there are outside actors that have
Yeah.
also their interests
So
on
let's
Syria.
stop you for a moment. So you've mentioned HTS. Who are the other actors? And then talk about the outside actors. Let's get
Sure.
through. Obviously, there are Kurdish forces, there's PKK, but there are others too. There's not just one Kurdish force, for
That's right.
instance, and there
Yeah,
isn't just one Sunni force as well. And
that's right.
let's not forget the Alawites and the Christians
Yes.
and the
Yes.
Druze.
Yes. So, well, let's start with the Kurds. Of course, the Kurds had created a kind of what they call Rojava, a kind of independent, if you will, or autonomous region. Very interesting kind of principles. They apparently got a book of Murray Bookchins many years ago and decided that they were going to kind of have a society along green socialism lines with the very strong participation by women. Women not
Yeah,
only in governance, but women in the military as well.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
In a way, they are way ahead of their neighbors.
yes. Now, of course, from the Turkish point of view, they're all PKK. They're all, uh,
Terrorists
terrorists who are
and drug
interested
smugglers.
in getting into Turkey and, wresting away regions of Turkey from Turkish central
Mhm.
control. So the Kurds are actually quite an interesting group, and one
Mhm.
can imagine a kind of Kurdistan scenario. Kurdistan, of
Mm.
course, being the section within Iraq that is controlled semi-autonomously or more or less autonomously by Kurds. One can imagine that that could happen in Syria. The Alawites, the Alevis, as you say, the kind of group around the Assads, a kind of Islamic minority, and that has, been close to Iran for often political reasons, that worries about its future, of course, because it's been tarred with Assad's legacy and having benefited from Assad and having produced many of the people that staffed Assad's government. So they, of course, are concerned. Christians, a diminishing population. Of course, Syria used to be home to one of the strongest Christian populations in the Middle East, but that population has dwindled over the years.
Yeah.
And then,
But
as you said,
isn't that the case with all Christian populations across the Middle East, pretty much?
yeah, pretty much. I mean, you still have, of course, some Coptic communities in
In
Egypt,
Egypt, yes, but
and but for the most part,
Iraq,
you
Syria,
have
yeah.
Christians in the Palestinian community, in Palestinian territories, of course. Um, and then, as you said, other Sunni formations, the folks backed more directly by Turkey and up in the north. And one can imagine all sorts of, inter-Sunni divisions. One of the reasons why al-Golani, basically survived in part was because he took a position against Islamic State. Islamic State, of course, being Sunni extremists further, if you will, down the
Yeah.
spectrum. Um, so a potential for, as you said, the centrifugal forces of Syria to spin out of control. And then it's a question of whether the outside actors are going to help contain that, or are they going to encourage that for their own
Mm.
purposes? And as we were talking about, Turkey potentially has its own kind of imperial ambitions, kind of taking back some of the territory that had previously been in the Ottoman Empire.
In particular, they eye all the way Syrian territory, all the way till Aleppo.
It's true. And now,
They
whether Erdogan
and
would
Aleppo
actually
is
do
was on the
that,
road to Constantinople,
yeah. Now,
or
the,
modern
the
day
the major
Istanbul.
reason though that Erdogan wants Syria, to be in some way, shape, or form coherent is because he wants to get rid of all the Syrian refugees who are in Turkey.
Yes,
They send them back home. So I
yeah.
don't think the primary issue on his mind right now is getting more Syrian territory. It's actually getting rid of what constitutes Syrian
A million
territory.
Syrians in Turkey,
Exactly.
or
Israel, of
Turkey,
course,
as we are supposed to say now.
yes. And Israel, of course, has expanded its control over the Golan Heights, as well as,
Well,
basically
we'll come
taking
to
out.
Israel's role in a second, because the Israelis have destroyed Syrian military assets,
Yes,
naval,
yes,
missile,
yes.
m-
Chemical weapons facilities,
army.
as you
So
enjoyed.
they've done a whole series of strikes which they had planned for decades. They've
Oh, yeah.
basically carried out every scenario that they had, and they've taken over
Yeah,
Golan Heights,
yeah.
all of them now.
Yeah, I mean, you could say this was, the primary victory for Israel above all
Yeah,
others in terms of,
and they
re
have taken some territory, as you just said before
yeah.
we began.
Yeah, and
So
I think, this their fear. Now, believe me, Israel was perfectly happy to have Assad there for some reasons, I mean, as a kind of force for
yeah.
stability, if you will, and particularly because Assad didn't seem to care very much about Palestinians, um,
Mhm.
and to ensure that there was not too much chaos on Israeli borders or fundamentalists of the type, for whether they're Shia like Hezbollah or Sunni like Hamas. It was wonderful for Israel to be able to have somebody else take care of those particular threats. And with Assad gone, well, yes, they've made sure to try to get rid of as much military material that might fall into the hands of whomever in Syria. So an opportunity, but I don't think Israel's particularly happy about the potential for a political vacuum in Syria and what might come. Any of those scenarios with perhaps
And
the
I
exception.
told some of my Israeli friends that, look, your big danger is not a Shia regime in Syria. It's not Hezbollah. Your big danger is a Sunni ruler who is charismatic, who can basically rile up or inspire, whatever word you want to use,
Yeah,
the Sunni world. And remember, Gamal Abdel Nasser did that,
yeah,
although he failed, going back to the 50s and 60s. And if you get an Islamist Sunni leader, um, well, Remember, Saladin was one such Sunni leader who made Egypt Sunni. Egypt was
Yeah,
Shia before then. So he converted Egypt from Shia
yeah,
tradition to Sunni Islam, and he took over Jerusalem in 1187. And
right.
this Sunni leader could be particularly dangerous.
Which leads us to the last scenario before we wrap up, and that is, of course, Saladin's seizure of Jerusalem inspired uh, the Crusades, the Western effort to go and retake Jerusalem. And of course, there are Western powers that have their own interests in Syria as well. The United States, of course, still has a military base. Donald Trump has said he wants to wash his hands of Syria, but there are still going to be powerful interests in the United States as well as in Europe. We're going to be like, look, we can't let this country just kind of fall apart. And a failed state, especially a
Mm.
failed state of the size of Syria, is a
Hang on a
major.
minute. It has been a failed state for years because at the end of the day, what we may be seeing is the end of the Sykes-Picot era
Mhm.
because these maps that Mr. Sykes and Miss Picot drew up were completely arbitrary.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
is Syria really a nation state? Is Syria really a country? Well, in reality, it isn't. And
Mhm.
many people, and including the Israelis and the British, are talking about Switzerland-like cantons of different
Mhm.
communities. Now,
Yeah,
the
yeah. I mean,
question is, will it be as peaceful as Switzerland?
well, and who knows how peaceful Switzerland is going to be in the future. But uh, yeah, I mean, and it's very similar to the conversations that took place uh, during the Iraq War, before, during, and after, about the future of Iraq, because Iraq too seemed like an improbable creature, if you will, with Sunni,
All of them. I mean,
Shia,
that's
and
also a
Kurds.
product of Sykes-Picot.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, you could argue to a certain extent that these were failed nation states. I wouldn't call them failed states exactly, because of course they had, a strong leader at the top who was
For a while,
ensuring that,
for a while, for a
yeah,
while.
but certainly failed nation states. Because the whole process that we're familiar with, for instance, in Western Europe, of the creation of a nation, what they call
Yeah,
the turning peasants into Frenchmen in France, for example, the whole process of a centralized army, education, language, that has not really taken place in the Middle East and is not likely to take place, because those
yeah.
kinds of transformations required an enormous amount of force, and that's just not going to happen in today's world. So, what then is left for a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional country like Syria? Well, cantons certainly is one possible scenario. Another possible scenario is not a very heavily federated country, but a country that is more decentralized, perhaps not on the order of cantons, but nevertheless um, uh, much less uh, centrally located in terms of power in Damascus. And to a certain extent, Iraq does represent that. But we have another example, even closer to home, in Europe at least, which is a negative example from my point of view, and that's Bosnia. Bosnia, of
Former
course,
Yugoslavia.
yeah, Bosnia is essentially three cantons,
Yeah.
Serb controlled, and then
Yes.
Croat and Bosniak. Does not function well as a country.
No.
Its economy is lousy. It has perennial instability. It's unlikely to join the European Union because it can't meet those requirements.
Yeah.
The last thing you want in the Middle East is a country that is as broken, basically, as Bosnia is. So trying to come up with some kind of solution which is both democratic and nonviolent to ensure some kind of stability of what it means to be Syrian in today's region and today's world, I think has got to be on the agenda for all of the actors inside Syria, and it should be in the back of the mind for all external actors looking at Syria as well.
The catch is that at the moment, there is violence in Gaza, there's violence in the West Bank. Lebanon is pretty much a failed state. And Syria is a much larger state. And so the chances of success I would say, seem dim.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't want to, I'm certainly not an optimist when it comes to this, but uh, on the other hand,
Yeah,
whenever there is a possibility of having a more beneficial scenario, i.e., one that it redounds to the benefits of the majority of the population in Syria, we have to go for that. And we can't just say, well, look, the odds are bad, and I'm sorry, we're not just going to pay any attention to it. It can go to hell in a handbasket. Even if there's only a slender possibility of having a new Syria, a democratic Syria, a Syria that meets the needs of the people from whatever confession, whatever religion they come from, whatever ethnic group they come from. We have to really push on that. And one could argue that it's precisely because the stakes are so much bigger in a big state that everyone realizes that they have to work together. In a small state, sometimes you have the narcissism of triviality, narcissism of trivial differences, what Freud said. The smaller the stakes, the more ridiculous the arguments get. It's the sheer size of Syria, the sheer um, uh, importance of Syria in the region and potentially in the world that will make people say, aha, we have to be more mature about our decision making.
got it. Now, one thing before we let you go that we are picking up all the way, not just within the Arab world, but all the way across Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, is the celebration in the Sunni world of the Umayyad mosque returning to Sunni hands. Given this schism in the Islamic world and given the heightened sectarian differences, uh, do you think we are at risk of a Shia Sunni conflict that spills over across into Iraq as well, and a future conflict with Iran, which
Mhm.
Israel might very much want?
Always possible. But, I always remind people who talk about the kind of perennial schism between Shia and Sunni. It's true. I mean, I'm outside the Islamic tradition. So for me, the differences between Sunni and Shia seem trivial, but I understand why they're important to the actors within those two particular camps. But I remind people, look, Iran and Saudi Arabia is kind of the two principal powerhouses of Shia and Sunni Islam. Yeah,
Indeed,
they were at each other's throats, and then through the kind of good offices of China, they came to a diplomatic rapprochement.
they're making out with each other.
Exactly. So, as long as there are um, overriding considerations, as long as there are other reasons why these countries or these faiths or these seemingly irreconcilable forces have to deal with one another, whether it's, to create a functioning state, whether it's to unite in the face of an adversary, whoever that adversary might be, whether it's because of some issue like climate change or resource depletion, whatever it is that provides the glue that's necessary, it's clearly possible for Shia and Sunni to come together, and that's Iran
Saudi
and
Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. We also saw cooperation, obviously, between Hamas and Hezbollah. I mean, they had a
Sure.
common
And and and
adversary.
and and, and apparently, the fall of Assad might have been a result of backroom dealings in Qatar, a country we haven't even mentioned, but
Yeah,
which is increasingly becoming a key actor, a key political player in the modern, what Pentagon likes to call volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, the VUCA world. Tiny
yes,
Qatar with Al Jazeera punches way above its weight.
absolutely. Well, you're going to have me on for another segment so we can talk about that.
Exactly. On that note, thank you for your time. I know you have to go to another meeting. But John Pfeffer, welcome back to FO Talks, and we will do this again. I enjoyed it very much.
This was a pleasure. Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.